Ask a right-winger what capitalism is and they'll be sure to conflate it with market exchange. There's also a tendency on the left, although it's not that dominant, to likewise reduce capitalism to commodity production, stating to the effect that where there is value in the Marxist sense, there is necessarily capitalism. Some had accused me of strawmanning here, but I've genuinely seen this argued. Nevertheless, as Engels explains in his supplement to Marx's Capital Volume 3, market exchange and value have actually been around for between 5 and 7,000 years. So what distinguishes this embryonic exchange of commodities which has existed for millennia from modern capitalist society? The answer is that commodity production has become generalized. Now, when Marx uses this term, he doesn't mean that lots of commodity production equates to capitalism. Rather, the generalization of commodity production means that commodity production has become the typical form of production in a given society. It is no longer simply a supplementary happening coexisting alongside a more dominant form of production, slave or feudal production for example, but now the means of production, land, raw materials and principally labor power itself have all become alienable commodities to be bought and sold. Marx writes that only when and where wage labor is its basis does commodity production impose itself upon society as a whole, but only then does it also unfold in all its hidden potentialities. One of these potentialities is the coming into being of a new form of capital, industrial capital or so it's called. Mandel writes in his introduction to Marxist economic theory, "What form does capital take in pre-capitalist society? It is basically usury capital and merchant or commercial capital. The passage from pre-capitalist society into capitalist society is characterized by the penetration of capital into the sphere of production. The capitalist mode of production is the first mode of production, the first form of social organization in which capital is not limited to the sole role of an intermediary and exploiter of non-capitalist forms of production, of small-scale commodity production. In the capitalist mode of production, capital takes over the means of production and penetrates directly into production itself. The penetration of capital into the production process is what makes capitalism a distinct mode of production distinguishable from the mere production of commodities. Yet the commodification of the means of production, land, labor power and so on is a precondition for this process to occur. Marx distinguishes between money invested in raw material, auxiliary material, and the instruments of labor, which he describes as constant capital, and also money invested in labor power, which has the capacity to expand the value of the previously mentioned commodities invested in production. Marx describes investment in labor power as variable capital because, to quote, "it both reproduces the equivalent of its own value and also produces an excess, a surplus value which may itself vary, may be more or less according to circumstances. This will be discussed in a moment." In Capital Volume 2, Marx outlines what he describes as the circuit of money capital characteristic of capitalist society. At first, it is money that takes the form of capital. Money is then invested into constant and variable capital, which Marx describes in the production process as productive capital. During the production process, that which is invested undergoes a process of transformation. The worker employs her labor and consequently produces a commodity of greater value than that initially invested in production. This, which Marx calls exploitation, we'll discuss in a moment. For now though, we should realize that the outcome of this process is the sale of the commodity which the worker has produced, consequently realizing the expansion of value and allowing the capitalist to reinvest with additional capital. This is what Marx calls capital accumulation. So the worker, according to Marx, has the capacity to expand the value of the commodities the capitalist purchases to transform and produce additional commodities to be sold for a profit. The worker's sale of her ability to do this we describe as wage labor. A wage is a monetary price which, like all prices, is governed by the laws of market exchange, both supply and demand and its cost of reproduction. The reproduction of labor power, of course, depends on the worker being capable of purchasing the means of subsistence, being healthy, and so on. Marx writes in Wage Labor and Capital, "The cost of reproduction of simple labor power amounts to the cost of existence and propagation of the worker. The price of this cost of existence and propagation constitutes wages. The wages thus determined are called minimum of wages. This minimum wage, like the determination of the price of commodities in general by cost of production, does not hold good for the single individual, but only for the race. Individual workers, indeed millions of workers, do not receive enough to be able to exist and to propagate themselves, but the wages of the whole working class adjust themselves within the limits of their fluctuations to this minimum." Marx describes in Capital Volume 1 how the working day can be split into two distinct parts, that of necessary labor and that of surplus labor. It's worth quoting at length for the fullest clarity. We have seen that the laborer during one portion of the labor process produces only the value of his labor power, that is, the value of his means of subsistence. Now, since his work forms part of a system based on the social division of labor, he does not directly produce the actual necessaries which he himself consumes, he produces instead a particular commodity, yarn for example, whose value is equal to the value of those necessaries or of the money which they can be bought. The portion of his day's labor devoted to this purpose will be greater or less in proportion to the value of the necessaries he daily requires on average, or what amounts to the same thing, in proportion to the labor time required on average to produce them. If the value of those necessaries represent on average the expenditure of 6 hours labor, the workman must on average work for 6 hours to produce that value. During the second period of the labor process, that in which his labor is no longer necessary labor, the workman, it is true, labors, expends labor power, but his labor being no longer necessary labor creates no value for himself. He creates surplus value which, for the capitalist, has all the charms of a creation out of nothing. This portion of the working day I name surplus labor time, and to the labor expended during that time I give the name of surplus labor. It is every bit as important for a correct understanding of surplus value to conceive it as a mere conjugation of surplus labor time. This analysis has radical conclusions. It presupposes that capitalist society cannot exist without the exploitation of the working class. Capitalist production cannot occur without the workers slaving away to produce more value than she herself is remunerated for. Surplus labor is taken advantage of by a class of parasites who've managed to monopolize property, by force I might add, and turn us all into their obedient subjects. Marx lambasts those who speak of a mythical fair day's wages for a fair day's work, stating that, instead of the conservative motto a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, the workers ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. This aspiration and how to achieve it, the goal of communists no less, will be outlined in an upcoming video. Thank you for watching, and thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon for making this video possible.